Good morning. Thank you for coming to UMMA to participate in this symposium. And I really want to thank to Fang, who, since her arrival in about two and a half years ago, it was a whirlwind for me to learn sort of a new, really changed my image of contemporary Chinese contemporary art. And last July, actually, she took me to a 1-week tour of Beijing and Shanghai, and seeing, visiting all these galleries, new museums. It was very, very exciting, and that really, affected, my sort of probably my, my vision about China, but also, for this museum and what we can, probably do in the next few years. So today my role is to introduce more in depth about the speakers of the first panel and also moderate the question session. So first speaker, Melissa Chiu. Dr. Melissa Chiu is director of the Smithsonian's Hirschhorn Museum and Sculpture Garden, the National Museum of Modern and Contemporary Art. Since her appointment in 2014, she has advocated for contemporary art through the museum's exhibitions, acquisitions, and public programs. A native of Australia, she completed her PhD with a dissertation on contemporary Chinese art at the University of Western Sydney. Dr. Chiu is the former director of Asia Society Gallery in New York. As the gallery's curator and then director, she organized numerous exhibitions of countries and cultures which were introduced to the American public for the first time. She also advocated for emerging artists from Asia through exhibitions and new initiatives. Dr. Chiu has authored and edited several books on contemporary art, including Contemporary Art in Asia, A Critical Reader in 2010, and Making a Museum in the 21st Century, published in 2015. Her today's talk is titled Chinese Contemporary Art in Formation, a Personal Chronicle. Please welcome Dr. Chiu.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Christina. Thank you, Fang. Thank you, Natsu, for convening all of us together. Yes, we have to open our PowerPoint. Very good. So it's actually a real pleasure to be here this morning because I feel like we have, Fang, you mentioned a certain maturity. I feel like there is a certain maturity to the conversations that we can now have about Chinese contemporary art. And I was really thinking a lot about this because just recently we witnessed the passing of Oku Yenwazor. And if I think of curators or people in our field who have had an enormous influence, although he had some engagement directly with Chinese contemporary art, and in fact his visit to China was a fabled kind of thing where, many of the artists tried to get his attention for the documenta that he was curating. But I really thought about his work that really began in the early 1990s and was really all about opening up the art world to an idea that artists could come, indeed, not from the centres of the art world like New York, London or Paris, but they could actually be based in other places and have an enormous influence on an idea of the centre. And so it was something in front of mind when I was thinking about what to talk about today. And so I thought, well, it would be rather interesting if I went back and thought to my early kind of engagement with Chinese contemporary art, because if I think of the artists who I first met and the curators who I first met, the art world in China and indeed around the world that we now think about has changed so much. And it's a real pleasure to be here with my colleagues who have been really at the forefront in defining what it means for American audiences. What is that idea of Chinese contemporary art? And so I thought I would offer just some moments of my own interaction with the Chinese contemporary art world, because I feel so old nowadays that I've moved so many times, and I thought, oh, wouldn't it be nice to dig out some of those old photographs? And then I realized I'd moved so many times that I didn't have as many old photographs as I thought I did. So then I started to think, well, let's talk about my own engagement with Chinese contemporary art in the context of that Chinese contemporary art history that, in fact, when I first started to go to China, it wasn't even written. That we forget now, but actually there was no moment of genesis that we've all talked about now today. I mean, I think, if anything, when we think about the birth of Chinese contemporary art, we always posit this moment of the stars, the Xingxing group, that coming out of the Cultural Revolution, that period from 1966 to 1976, that it was that moment at which China, of course, declared its open door policy with Deng Xiaoping, but it was a moment at which artists were able to harness a kind of that openness where they could basically paint and sculpt in a way that they wanted to, coming out of the Cultural Revolution when everything was predetermined. And so this exhibition was such an important exhibition, and I think when I first went to China in 1992, we were kind of grappling in a way with what this exhibition meant. And it was an exhibition that in some ways defined the decade to come. I often have tried to think of the history of Chinese contemporary art in 3 decades. And this first decade, really, from 1979 to 1989, is in some ways defined by this moment of the Stars group. And it was a moment of frenetic energy opening up, a great kind of optimism about the world and the potential for art. And you'll see here, even though the photograph is kind of grainy, you'll see here that these were not artists who were continuing the legacy of the Cultural Revolution. It was a demarcation where these artists were all about individual artistic expression. And while we may look to this art as not necessarily being particularly radical for an American context, it certainly was in a Chinese context. And so I think this first decade of 79, with the birth of the Chinese contemporary art movement as we see it from the Stars through to 1989, it was a moment that we know now as being really about a successive kind of consumption, a great appetite for learning about the potential of art. And that really meant looking at Western art, largely. It was Western, looking at Western art magazines and things like that, so that and many of the images, interestingly enough, looked rather conservative with our eyes, that if we think to what was going on here in the States in 79. But I kind of see it as a process. It was a process of kind of coming out of the Cultural Revolution and seeing the world with different eyes. And so many artists were able to really form themselves into groups. We saw many, many art groups all across the country, whether it was Shaman Dada, with Huang Yongping as one of the leaders, or even the Big Tail Elephant group in Guangzhou was working, and so it saw this kind of frenetic art activity, and then it kind of, in some ways, this exhibition at the National Gallery of Art. So where the Stars impromptu exhibition, it wasn't at a museum, it was actually hung, you saw on the fence of the park facing the National Gallery. Well, here we are, 1 decade later, the China Avant-Garde exhibition was actually inside the museum at the China Art Gallery. And that was a moment of, another kind of moment of coming of age. And you'll see here the logo that these artists used. It was a huge show, over 100 artists. And you'll see that it was a kind of curatorial, it was a moment at which there was a desire to take account of this decade, of all of the different experimentations that had happened all across the country. And you'll see that the logo that they used was this no U-turn, no going back. It was only facing forward. And I think that that was really the zeitgeist of the moment. They never wanted to go back. Of course, at that exhibition, it was Xiaolu who here is shown shooting her artwork that then prompted the closure of the exhibition. And I chose this image of Gong Jinyi that is now considered an iconic work from the period. But I was more interested in the background. So you see the background of this, where the photographs photographed before they went to the museum exhibition. And it gives you an indication of the kind of infrastructure that was there for artists in China, that these artists had fairly small studio spaces. There was no, I mean, it's hard to imagine today, there was no gallery space to show their work. There was no art shipping company. There was, these were artists who basically would have rolled and unrolled their work and then transported it to the National Gallery. It was actually at this moment when many artists decided to leave China. And in a way, that was my first encounter with Chinese contemporary artists, because a number of them, including Xiaolu and her husband then Tang Song, settled in Sydney, where I was living. And so I was fortunate enough to meet them when they first arrived in Australia, and there were a number of them. And there was a large-scale exhibition where we were able to see lots of their work. So if we think of this being 1989, and what was a curiosity to me was how quickly the contemporary art world was interested in this movement. So this is flash art from 1992, interesting, huh? So this is 1 year before the Venice Biennale presentation of Chinese contemporary art, and then also 1 year before these two books and exhibitions. And I show a lot of books in this presentation, primarily because I think it's through the catalogues that we have learned much about Chinese contemporary art. When after a couple of trips to China to see what was going on, I decided to embark on study for a PhD focused on Chinese contemporary art. And my professor at that moment asked me, first of all, why Chinese contemporary art, and secondly, what books existed. And at that moment in time, there were 2 books, and these were the 2 books. So, and then her next question to me was, or really statement, was more about, well, is it really a field? Can you, her question was less about make a contribution, but is it really something that's going to be sustainable? And she was doing due diligence, I think, for me, although at the time I was interested in what was going on, that it felt like there was something important and something even of a national or international scale going on. So these were 2 books, one from an exhibition in Berlin at the House of World Cultures, and the other from a Hong Kong exhibition, China's New Art Post-89. It started in Hong Kong, and then a second iteration actually came to Sydney, where I was able to see it for the first time. I mentioned the Venice Biennale presentation. This is a great shot of Wang Yi, and he was the kind of darling of this first wave of international recognition of Chinese contemporary art. You'll see him, he's a really cool dude. I mean, he was the one who was he was integrating those first logos. So multinationals were for the first time kind of allowed into China as a kind of as part of the open door policy. And he started to integrate these socialist, realist, poster style paintings with those logos in a marriage for which was totally emblematic of the kinds of push and pull of what was going on in Chinese society at that moment in time in the early 1990s. So you have here his presentation. It was a real moment. We often think of Chinese contemporary art as 1993 being really that moment where Chinese contemporary art was at the Venice Biennale here. It was, you had two major international shows, one in Europe, one in Asia, that subsequently went to the Museum of Contemporary Art. So they kind of, the Museum of Contemporary Art in Sydney worked with Li Shenting, who was one of the curators of the China's New Art post-89 show, and they remade it with this title, Malgo's Pop, which in some ways signals the interest in the political pop and cynical realism movements of the time. And the show was obviously a focus more on this type of work. This is Liu Wei's work. And that was a moment at which I think as a student in Australia in 1992, 1993, that I met a number of these artists, and they all came in for the exhibition, whether it's Xu Bing, Liu Wei, and others. But there was this whole immigrant community who stayed after the June 4th incident. And so they made up a very close-knit community, and here is Guan Wei, who was one of the most successful of that generation of artists. Shen Xiaoming pictured here as well. Tang Song and Xiao Lu, they all contributed to that, well, actually nearly all contributed to that Malgo's Pop exhibition. But then I organized an exhibition in 1992 at the university where I was based, all about their work, and they had really just come to Australia. None of them spoke English. They were still working through a very different art system, and Guan Wei was the one artist of that generation who found most success in Australia. He was very soon after arriving taken up by one of the major galleries and became a mainstay of what it meant to be a multicultural Australian artist. And so he was subsumed into a much larger cultural debate, to the extent that his work was reproduced on the front page of the major Sydney newspaper. He was chosen as an Olympics artist in 2000 and all sorts of things. So he found most success, but the interesting part about this generation of artists, much like many others, was that he returned to China. And many of them did, who left China. So when I started to actually visit China in the early 1990s, the person you had to go and see was Li Shenting, right? Actually you couldn't kind of broker any idea of that community without him. And so, and this is a picture that I took in Feng Li Jun's studio in 1993 with his kitten. It's kind of a funny picture because even then, like we're talking 1993, even then they had a market for their work. So they were already charging in US dollars to buy their work, because after the success of the international shows and the Venice Biennale and everything, they already had a market, and it was an external market. There was no domestic market at all. But I spent a lot of time with Li Shenting and his kind of coterie of artists on the outskirts, which are not the outskirts anymore of Beijing, but they were the outskirts then. And he was really, having curated the Hong Kong exhibition, China's art post-89, he was really considered the grandfather of that art scene. And he was the one who selected the artists to be in the big international art exhibitions. He was the one who kind of interviewed them, who really had created an artistic community. And so it was interesting, I interviewed him on a number of occasions and published the interviews in what was then Art Asia Pacific. And I just bring this up because it's gone through many iterations, but that was the primary way that you found information about Asian contemporary art, and also to some extent Chinese contemporary art, because it was in English and it was widely distributed through libraries and even the usual kind of news agencies as they were. But it was interesting because even at this moment in time, I remember speaking to him about issues around what could and couldn't be shown in China, what could and couldn't be said in China, because this was a moment at which it's hard now to imagine, but it was a post-Tiananmen period. And that post-Tiananmen period went on for a long time, actually, because there was no alternative infrastructure for artists to show their work, and so they were very externally facing. And Li Shenting was that spokesperson for that generation. And he would say, when I would ask him about, what can and can't be said here as opposed to when you go overseas, and he would say that you can say whatever you like until somebody says that you can't. And what that really meant was that it all depends on the interpretation of what you're saying. And so that's why I think so many Chinese contemporary artists were so adept at speaking to an international audience. They were very, they had a very sophisticated vocabulary to be able to kind of maneuver between what was permissible within the domestic sphere and what worked well internationally. So while most people were focused on the political pop and cynical realism painters, I show these books because they were a conceptual project. The black flag book, white and grey, and they were all, they really, I think, were emblematic of the fact that there was a very robust painting community around Li Shenting, political pop, cynical realism. But in addition to that, there was a very strong tendency towards conceptual and installation art. And that was almost like a second wave of museum exhibitions. There were a number of installation art exhibitions, of which I think artists like Wang Wei and Wang Yushen were front and center of those kinds of considerations. So I think that what's interesting is that even back then, there were different camps, although there wasn't always an understanding of how those groups kind of intersected. If I think back to some of the artists who connected me to China, this was one artist called ASEAN who I showed at. I actually showed this work when he first created it in 1999 at a space that I had established called 4A, or otherwise known as the Asia Australia Art Centre. And it was those kinds of grassroots organizations that often were able to support that recently arrived Chinese diasporic community. And what I became interested in for my PhD. So I think I had traveled back and forth to China for some years, and I was trying to work out, how do you make a PhD, or how do you make research out of something that is in formation? Because that was one of my professor's issues. It's like, okay, well, you want to take account of it, but how do you do it when it's moving, right? And that's why a lot of American universities really didn't allow people to study Asian contemporary art for a long time, because it was still this idea that it was informal and not able to be historically accounted for. So the idea that I had for my own research, through looking at the way that this Australian Chinese community settled and kind of made their way in the world, was to look at that generation of Chinese artists through the idea of diaspora. And so if we think of an artist like ASEAN who came to his Chinese heritage via settling in Australia, he started to create work that was very different from work actually being done back in China. And so here we have him this looks to us perhaps reminiscent of a death mask, but it was actually a cast of his brother, and he started to cast friends and family. But then to overlay them with traditional Chinese porcelain designs that have a history dating back to the Ming Dynasty and earlier. And he created these works at Jingdezhen. So he went back to the place where known for its imperial kilns, and created this work as a way of going back, but also of remembering his Chinese heritage, but signaling also the indelible mark that Chinese cultures had on him, his friends, his family. And so it was through this idea that my own research expanded, and I began to look closely at those artists who had not just settled in Australia, but also New York and Paris. And what I found in the process was that this idea of diaspora was a very interesting one, because there are very few moments in a country's history, and I talk about China here, where a whole generation leaves the country. This was a moment in the 1980s when the whole country was gripped by, they called it leave the country fever. And so within the artistic and creative communities, anybody who could leave would leave. And so you had a whole generation of intellectuals who left. They settled across the world. And then the idea is, okay, what happens when they settle? And so my thesis that was eventually published in a book called Breakout was this idea of what happens, how is this idea of a diaspora refracted through artwork? And I used the idea that Chen Zhen had formulated, which was very unique. He had devised this idea called trans experience. And in a way, it was an artistic way of categorizing this diasporic experience. So I used that as a way of looking very carefully at the Chinese communities outside. And the interesting part was those who remained developed a much more conceptual art practice that was not at all related to Chinese signifiers like ASEAN had used. So it was an interesting moment, and by the time I ended up finishing up the book, which was a translation of my PhD, I had to add on an end chapter because they were all going back. Like when I started, it was an exile community, and I was like, they're all going back, and that changes everything. And so in a way, the end chapter was the return home. And we would never have imagined that when they were all leaving in the 80s, that they would actually really want to go back. And they all went back. They went back in different ways. They either returned fully, or they established studios, or went half-time. But there was this whole kind of drawback to China, which was really interesting. So here in the US, when we think about Chinese contemporary art, we have to talk about this exhibition, which was in 1998. It was conceived by the Asia Society and then went on tour around the country. But it was important because it was curated by Gao Minglu. And Gao Minglu, I think, was one who thought of himself as as a spokesperson for Chinese contemporary art. He had been here in the US for a number of years before organizing this exhibition, and really felt very strongly about creating his own stamp on Chinese contemporary art as in a way, a nod, if you like, to Li Shenting's exhibition, China's New Art Post-89. So this was an extremely important exhibition for the reception of Chinese contemporary art in this country, and really defined in some ways the whole idea of it being an expansive focus on work from the 1990s mostly. When I settled in New York in 2001, I had already begun my research on Chinese contemporary art, and what I found when I arrived in New York was actually beyond Inside Out. There was not a whole lot of information about Chinese contemporary art. That Inside Out had made a certain mark within New York. In fact, Feng Li Jun's painting was on the cover of the New York Times Magazine, so it made a big initial impact. But after that, in fact, what was so interesting was I convened a symposium in 2002, and a number of the major collectors who had acquired quite a lot of Chinese contemporary art from inside out were quite dispirited. They said, what happened to Chinese contemporary art? And that was only a few years later. And so when I did this study, because I was very interested in how Chinese contemporary art and Asian contemporary art was positioned in a place like New York. And so I did this study, and it was all about kind of how you account for recognition. And so we did an analysis on gallery exhibitions, museum exhibitions, and auction records. And the interesting piece is that there was, in terms of the top 5 artists at auction or at galleries, there was not a single Chinese artist mentioned. So that gives you some indication that in the inside-out kind of fame, in some ways didn't have a lot of stickiness. And so that was, I think, a point of interest to me, at least, because I had thought that Inside Out would have a lot more traction. I then finally published my book. This is Chinese Art Outside China. This is ASEAN on the front cover. He'd begun to do major lacquer works, which were again speaking to this idea of the indelible mark that Chinese history has on the corporeality. And then in my tenure at Asia Society, I began to look at other ways to speak about Chinese contemporary art. And the curatorial question was really, okay, how do you, how do we allow audiences to understand Chinese contemporary art beyond that nation state or historical focus? And so I began a process of looking at this. And one of the first exhibitions that I did after an exhibition of ASEAN's work was this exhibition of Jung Hwan's work. Now, Jung Hwan had been featured prominently, in fact, in the Inside Out exhibition, and had done a performance at PS1 as part of that exhibition. So he was well known to audiences, but really well known for his photographs of his performances that began in around the early 1990s in Beijing's East Village. Now, what was interesting was that Jung Hwan decided to stay in the United States after the Inside Out exhibition. So he stayed, made his way in the New York art world, and then he, as I mentioned, like many artists, went back to China. Now, when he went back to China, he almost fully abandoned his performance art practice and began to make these works. And when I visited his studio in China and saw these works, it was extraordinary to think that he was an artist who only used his body. Then he went back to China as performance artwork. Then he went back to China in about 2005 and began to make large-scale, enormous sculptures. And that showed this kind of trend that we saw within China of the ambition in terms of scale, and wanting to communicate their ideas in a way that we had not seen before. And so this was an exhibition that traced his 15 years of practice that began with performance works, quite radical performance works in China, in Beijing's East Village, and then ended to his return to China, and in fact returned to China, but Shanghai, not Beijing, and with these works that were inspired in part by his trip to Tibet and this whole Buddhist kind of connection that he had. The next way that I kind of thought about Chinese contemporary art was to actually go a little bit further back in history. When I did a number of artist interviews for my research, nearly all of them, as a curiosity, said to me, if you want to understand my work, you have to go back to the Cultural Revolution. And that was a really interesting common statement that they nearly all made, but a revelation because most people would never have thought of the Cultural Revolution as a time that could spark creativity or even help artists to think about the world in different ways. It was a time that was largely accounted for in terms of its politics. It was a moment at which politics pervaded every aspect of life, and artists were not permitted to draw or paint or conceive of anything that was not about the political party, and especially Mao. However, for this younger generation of artists, they were all the Red Guards of this period. They were sent down to the countryside, and then for them, their remembering this period was a whole other type of experience. And it did actually set the groundwork for a very particular type of relationship to art and iconography. It is almost impossible for us to imagine in this country a common ground of posters or visual imagery that is common to everyone. But that's what happened during the Cultural Revolution. That this population of over 1 billion people saw the same images over and over and over and over again. They all knew these posters. They were everywhere. And so this is a picture of Zheng Shengtian and I. We travel all across China to gather together works that were essentially from the Cultural Revolution. And, I saw Shengtian recently, and we kind of said, you probably could never do this show at this moment in time, because we had all of the artists. Actually, we had been working with the Chinese government on a number of important loans, and the Wang Qingsong work was one of them from the National Museum. And then as we got closer to 2008 being the year of the Beijing Olympics, there was an issue. And there was a statement made, although never published, communicated to all government agencies that the Cultural Revolution was not to be spoken of. And so that presented a problem for our exhibition, because we had negotiated all these amazing loans of these paintings. And so the government agency withdrew from the exhibition. And so Shengtian and I were left in a position of saying, okay, do we try to do this show in spite of this obstacle? And so we went back to all of the artists that we had met with in this 3-year research period. And we found that many of them had works that they had not shown us. And so we were able to actually borrow a number of paintings, sketches, studies from those and major other private loans to continue the exhibition. And I think it was important. It was an important exhibition to set a kind of historical record of the period as an artistic period, not just as a political period. I threw this one in because, in all my studies about Diaspora, New York, of course, was one of those major places. And I love the fact that this is Tan Duan, who then went on to actually win an Oscar for his Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon. But this was the emigre community, right? And I did an exhibition at the Asia Society right at the time when Ai Weiwei was arrested, of his photographs from his New York period. And it was 200 photographs of him within his Chinese emigre community. And it was interesting to see Chen Kaige, Lin Tianmiao, all these folks who were in New York who have gone on to do amazing things. And then thinking about women artists, one of the questions that a lot of people have of Chinese contemporary art is, where are the women? And this is a big issue. I remember being in China in 1995 at the time of the women's conference. Hillary Clinton was there. There was a major women's art exhibition. And so I was always very mindful of that. And it was hard to do research. I think it's my phone, sorry. I don't know why that's an alarm. And so I really wanted to do an exhibition that was about her and her work. She was one of 3 women artists that I did an article about in 1995 and published in Art Asia Pacific as a bit of a response to the fact that everyone said there were no Chinese women artists. So I wanted to trace her history a little bit from that early to mid 1990s through to today. And this was a work that she created for that Asia Society exhibition that I curated, where she bound with silk objects that had been fused together, often spray guns with bones and things like that. There were strange, very strange objects, but we wanted to show her kind of individual artistic evolution. And then my final image is this, because this is the Guggenheim Exhibition that was just recently configured. And it was, in some ways, a very different account of Chinese contemporary art than that has been told previously. And I think there was very much an effort towards conceptual art practices. In fact, the painters who we mentioned as political pop, cynical realism painters who were highly feted in the early 1990s were not at all present in this account of Chinese contemporary art. And I think that was a really interesting omission. And so now, as we kind of face forward to 40, 50 years of these kinds of debates around Chinese contemporary art, we now think about how we historicize it, how we discuss it, how there's much more room, I think, for different versions of Chinese contemporary art than there ever were before. So thank you very much for your time.
Our next speaker is Daisy Yiyou Wang. Dr. Daisy Wang is the Robert N. Shapiro Curator of Chinese and East Asian Art at the Peabody Essex Museum. She leads the museum's Chinese, Japanese, and Korean art exhibition programs, collection-based installations, research, and acquisitions. She co-curated Empresses of China's Forbidden City, a major exhibition that sheds new light on the role of empresses in shaping Qing court art and history. Currently shown, just opened last week at the Smithsonian's Freer and Sackler galleries. Before coming to Peabody, she was a curator at the Freer and Sackler galleries, where she contributed to a number of exhibitions, including artist Saigo Chan's explosion event on the National Mall. Her publications cover topics ranging from Buddhist art to contemporary art and the history of collecting Chinese and Korean art. Dr. Wang earned her PhD in art history from Ohio State University and is a recipient of a Getty Museum Leadership Fellowship and the Smithsonian Postdoctoral Fellowship. Today's her talk is titled China of the Present Tense, Strategies and Challenges of Displaying Chinese Contemporary Art in American Museums. Please welcome Daisy.
Thank you, Natsu, very much, and thank you, Fan, and thank you all my University of Michigan colleagues for putting together this wonderful symposium. And also I want to thank Melissa, who actually gave me a fellowship at the early stage of my career, so I was able to work with you on a number of exhibitions you just mentioned, so bring really wonderful memories. And also, convening like this, I think is very important to our field because one of the sort of starting points of my career is 2000 Shanghai Biennale. At the time, I was interpreter, but I've never seen elsewhere so many smart people, so many good-looking people. That really inspired me to study in America, to pursue a degree in art history, and here I am. So thank you all for coming. Today, my talk is entitled China of the Present Tense. I want to shift focus a little bit from sort of the history of displaying Chinese contemporary art here and elsewhere to something that is looking at the audience, and particularly looking at some of the case studies inside museums which are not contemporary and modern art focused, but really there's a lot of museums in this country, including UMMA, that has a collection of Chinese art that really goes back, and a collection that is not particularly strong in Chinese art of the 20th and 21st century and how we deal with Chinese contemporary art. So this is my museum, Peabody Essex Museum, located in Salem, Massachusetts. It is a museum of global art and culture. The museum began its history back to 1799. It was established by early ship captains and traders who went around the world and brought back artifacts to educate American folks about art outside America. And the museum is the first in this country to collect and present Chinese art starting from the year 1800. And also back to the 18th century, what happened to the city is that it is one of the earliest American trade ports actually doing a lot of business. In fact, back to 1785, one of the earliest American ships actually reached Guangzhou or Canton at the time. And I also want to say that back to 18th and 19th century, the museum was collecting contemporary art. Of course, there is always a dialogue. At the time, the collectors, particularly those travelers, went to China. They were actually talking to contemporary photographers at the time. For example, people like John Thompson, Milton Miller, working in China and Hong Kong. And they were collecting their works at the time. So we were at the time collecting artifacts produced around the time they were living, and also collecting from living artists. So today, the museum is very strong actually in 19th century photography of China because of the interest during that time and interest in China at the moment. And also, not surprisingly, the museum holds one of the largest collection of Chinese art made for international market. We call it export, Chinese export art. And the museum over the years has had presented many exhibitions of Chinese art or culture, from historical art to contemporary art, including some of the images you're very familiar with is 2009, we presented Wuli Sik's collection in an exhibition called Mahjiang, Contemporary Chinese Art from the Sikh Collection. But also, as I mentioned, the museum is very strong in art produced in 18th and 19th century, but not particularly strong in art produced in the 20th and 21st century. So one of the questions we want to ask ourselves as museum professionals is that how can we better understand our audience needs? And how do we better gauge their interest? And how do we actually present more effectively Chinese art, both historical and contemporary art? So what we have done is in 2012, we commissioned a front-end study. We invited a firm called Audience Focus, really to think about how can we better understand audience perception of Chinese art, and how these perceptions of Chinese art align with perceptions of China today. So the goal is, how do we more effectively gauge the interpretive approach to Chinese art in exhibition in general. So here are our samples. So we interviewed 69 folks, mainly visitors, to the museum, and these are the demographics of the samples. So we used actually a very straightforward and easy to do method. It's called PMM, called personal meaning mapping. So, with some kind of guidance, you could easily conduct that in your own museum, actually based on relatively small sample. So the idea is that we actually hand out to our visitor a piece of paper, and in the center is a bubble, and we have the word Chinese art. And when we interview those folks, we ask them to write down those words first came to their mind when they encounter the word Chinese art. So here we come. Dragons, kimonos, Chinese symbols, fans, all kinds of things. And then what we do is we ask them to sit down with us for 5-10 minutes, and we interview them, say, why dragons? Why kimonos? Why fans? So we actually write down their response, their answers to our questions. We got a lot of information. So the idea is really to get an understanding of their basic understanding, their sort of knowledge level about your topic, in this case is Chinese art, but also sort of really to gauge the gut reaction to your topic. In this case is Chinese art. So what are their responses? So these are the categories of their responses. So they really approach Chinese art from the point of view, types of art, content, media, context, properties, style, qualities, personal connections, and preferences. So these are something we all expected, even talking about American art. But what are the findings we have here? So I think that this is definitely not unique to the Peabody Essex Museum. So one of the things we found out is that people in general are more interested in art in general than about Chinese art. So it's a particular niche in the broader picture of their art knowledge. And most people had a traditional perception of Chinese art. So when they look at Chinese art, they think about jade, they think about calligraphy, they think about porcelain, textile, furniture. Also, the third point here is not surprising, is they do have a big notion about political repression. For many audience, that means traditional art forms suppressed or destroyed, particularly during the Cultural Revolution. So I think that Melissa's exhibition about art and during the Cultural Revolution is very significant, is that it really countered their stereotypical view about the period. And not surprisingly, kimono, they often conflated Chinese art with Japanese art. But also, we found what is also relevant to today's topic are three. So many people describe Chinese art as peaceful, ancient, or historical, not aware of the existence of contemporary art practices in China today. And second is they describe Chinese art today as industrial, busy, frenetic, and commercial, negative. I guess that's something to do with how generally our press, our media present China today. And also people knew very little about Chinese art in general, but they understand that Chinese art and China today are rooted in tradition. So what are the implications for our future exhibitions of Chinese art is, I think it's very important to provide context to people who are approaching Chinese art, both contemporary, historical. And I'm so glad that in the current exhibition at the UMMA, Wang Qingsong, Beijing, Detroit, that is really interesting and drawing that really help people to understand where he comes from and his inspiration during the Mao period, very important. Second is to share stories about art and artists, because our audience seek an experiential encounter with art. And third point is that we as curators, as museums, we want to deliver surprises. We want to counter stereotypical perception about Chinese art in China today. For example, in my current exhibition about Chinese Qing dynasty empresses from 17th century to the early 20th century, that we intentionally actually borrowed a footwear used by these empresses to show actually they had normal feet, because most people think about historical women in China, they think about bound feet. And the last finding relevant to my talk today is how do we build bridges of understanding between the past and present, because most of our visitors have some familiarity with Chinese traditional art, like jade and paintings, but how do we say actually, Chinese, we have vibrant contemporary art practices today, and they're rooted, but also sometimes radically different from traditional practices. So what I will do is that I'll share some thoughts about a number of exhibitions that use the strategy of connecting traditional art with contemporary art. One of the case study is Yang Fuzhong 7 Intellectuals in a Bamboo Forest, curated by Melissa and Miwako Tezuka at the Asia Society Museum, 2009. And I had privilege actually to help Melissa and Miwako interviewing the artists and really looking at installation, think about the strategies, all kinds of interesting things. And this is a series that Yang Fudong created between 2003 and 2007, so it's a 5-part. Each year he invites a group of young people, in this case both men and women, and it's actually a non-narrative form. So they are sort of doing all kinds of activities, either in a natural landscape, in this case Yellow Mountain, or in cityscape. And I think one of the challenges for visitors to the Asian Society is to really understand who are the 7 intellectuals in the bamboo forest, because Yang Fudong loosely borrowed from a group of people active in the 3rd century in China. These were recluses. They abandoned their public life and really to immerse themselves in arts and sometimes in drinking. So what we have done is that we use the traditional art as a more like a didactic tool for really to help people to understand the topic, understand his sort of source of inspiration. So in a separate space, because Yang Fudong is basic film work, and we actually have 5-6 continuous gallery configured to host his work. But in a separate gallery, we showed a number of traditional artworks, both from Chinese tradition and then from Japanese tradition. So the idea is to lay out who are these 7 intellectuals in historical setting, but also conceptually. A notion here is that the concept, the images of 7 intellectuals, they change, they evolve in different cultural contexts. I think that's also relevant to Yang Fudong's concept about 7 intellectuals. And currently, we are about to open an exhibition called A Lasting Mementa, John Thompson Photographs Along the Ming River. This is to show this masterpiece by 19th century Scottish photographer John Thompson. He actually visited China as one of the earliest photographers, really going to those remote areas beyond the treaty ports. In this case, he went to Fujian province, and he documented people and places in a very intimate way and a very compelling way, such as this image shows you. What is also interesting for this sort of jewel-like exhibition showing this particular series from John Thompson is that we actually took this opportunity to acquire several works by Luo Dan. In 2010, he actually was very inspired by Jack Kerouac, as well as by John Thompson. He understood John Thompson, he appreciated his work, so he went to Yunnan province and documented people and their activities. So in one gallery, we're showing John Thompson, but also we have a standalone space dedicated to Luo Dan in order to create a dialogue. But also to me, what is interesting is you can tell the stories of 2 artists living from different culture, living in different time, and how they approach the idea of journeys. How do they approach the idea of documenting people and places? But also want to talk a little bit about a 2006 and 2007 exhibition curated by my predecessor, Nancy Berliner. Nancy is actually a specialist in Chinese architecture and particularly vernacular furniture. So what I thought was a wonderful exhibition is what she has done is, in an exhibition called Inspired by China, she invited 22 furniture makers and artists, including artists like Ai Weiwei. And what she has done is ask them to come to the Peabody Essex Museum and conducted a 3-day study sessions and demonstration. For example, she invited somebody from rural areas in Anhui province and never been out of the country, but has always doing bamboo furniture. He did a demonstration. So we have 22 studio furniture makers and artists, both from America and from China, come together to study objects, study living artist practices, but also what we have done is we invited these artists to create works in response or inspired by traditional objects. In addition to juxtaposing the traditional and contemporary pieces, the exhibition catalog also traces the foreign influences on Chinese furniture and the Chinese influence on American furniture. So looking at artistic dialogue as a dynamic multi-way process. So here are some of the works. One work by Shi Jianming in response to a 19th century root stool. And this is by Ai Weiwei. He was very much intrigued by the idea about the connection between the architecture and the furniture. Here he basically fused through very traditional Chinese method called joinery, mortise and tenon system. He fused a square table with a beam from a historical building. So what are the takeaways from artists who actually participated in this project? Artist by the name of Gord Peterin. He is actually starting to question himself and his perception of China. What is in the heart of China? How does a country remain so visible and yet so invisible? This delicate object, actually, what he has done is that he was inspired by a 17th century cloisonné incense stand, but he used electric wire and metalwork and create a incense stand, but could not hold any incense, I guess. This delicate object will trace the complicated arteries that lead to the fragile China we might not see. I was inspired to look more closely. A similar approach is taken by a curator at the time at the Museum of Fine Arts Boston. His name is Hao Shen. Many of you probably have seen the exhibition and remember the exhibition is called Fresh Ink, 10 Takes on Chinese Tradition, because the Museum of Fine Arts Boston is known for its very strong holding of Chinese traditional ink paintings, particularly Song Dynasty paintings. So what they have done is they invited 10 Chinese or Chinese American artists, and this work is by Yu Hong. And she was inspired by an early 12th century scroll painting called Court Ladies Preparing Newly Woven Silk, attributed to actually an emperor artist, Huizong. So in response, actually, she cast all the characters in a contemporary setting, reminded me a little bit of Wang Qingsong's approach. But also, the process is very important. It took them many years, actually, to invite individual artists to come to their storage, to study their traditional collection. So you see Li Huayi looking at Song paintings, open paintings. But also, you see Ano Chang, this Chinese-American artist studying Jackson Pollock. I want to end my presentation with one very recent exhibition curated by Liu Yang, but also you see very unusual credit here, concept designed by Robert Wilson. And how many of you have seen the show at the Minneapolis Institute of Art? Called Power and Beauty in China's Last Dynasty. So yes, we have Chinese artists looking at Chinese tradition. We have Chinese American artists looking at American art tradition. In this case, we have a theater designer, visual artist, theater director, Robert Wilson, looking at a Chinese collection at the Minneapolis Institute of Art. Himself, actually, I was told, was also an avid collector of Chinese art, particularly Chinese furniture. So what is really interesting is that I think he took a very conceptual approach and really to ask the question, what indeed is Chinese art? He also collaborated in this exhibition. If you look at the backdrop, actually is by Yang Yongliang, the Shanghai-based contemporary artist who stitched many images of cityscape in China, but then having sort of the aesthetic of Chinese traditional ink painting. So Robert Wilson actually contacted him and actually borrowed, actually had a license to borrow his image as the backdrop So he is actually looking at the Chinese traditional collection, particularly the Qing dynasty from the 17th century to the early 20th century. But he also engaged visitor senses. For example, he used very dramatic lighting. There is a very specialized lighting designer and sound designer. In this gallery, yes, you see scholars' rocks, you see jades, you see all kinds of things, and what you hear is actually traditional pipa, and suddenly, thunderstorms. So it's very, very interesting. I think, I think a lot of people probably have very different views about the exhibition, but also I think what this exhibition is doing is help us to question what is Chinese art. And rather than traditional approach to encase works, and he encaged works, so you can see a detail of the case design and with meshes. So here are some of the questions I want to ask all of us here is that when we connect, when we're doing this kind of exhibition, when we display Chinese art in this kind of setting, what are the relationship between contemporary and historical art? And what is the role of contemporary artists? And how do we display them? And how do our visitors experience them? A quote from Robert Wilson after he actually designed the exhibition at the Minneapolis Institute of Art, and he is really taking a theatrical approach to question, what is it? Well, I will end my PowerPoint by also sharing one very new thing that I'm learning by doing Chinese art-related exhibition in America is that in recent years, there's a huge change in terms of visitorship. Chinese art exhibitions, both traditional and contemporary, in American museums are attracting a significant number of Chinese-speaking visitors. This is very significant. So for me, these are my curatorial takeaways. So when we as curators, when we create a checklist, and from the very beginning that we really need to create a bilingual checklist, and we as curators, we need to advocate for Chinese-speaking visitors. And also inside the galleries, on the website, and during our press events, and in our press release, we need to create Chinese language labels and other didactics and press materials. And also offer Chinese language tours. And very importantly, you don't want to end up doing all the tours yourself. That it's very important for us to recruit Chinese-speaking volunteers and supporters. And one surprising thing I learned in my recent exhibitions are, I always assume that Chinese visitors know more about their own country, about their own culture and their art. Yes, to some extent. Yes, they do come with a special angle. They have a certain level of knowledge about Chinese art and Chinese culture and history, but particularly when you talk about cultural revolution, particularly I think your visitors coming to see Wang Qingsong and how he actually referred to works back to the 1950s. And Chinese visitors also need context. They also need explanation. So I think that we cannot always assume that Chinese visitors are always much more knowledgeable about China than non-Chinese visitors. Well, maybe this telepathy between me and Melissa is that one of the interesting things when I read online about this exhibition organized by Alexandra Monroe and Philip Tineri and Ho Hanru is that this exhibition was a huge hit amongst Chinese-speaking visitors. So actually, I read something online. So they hired marketing experts at SF MoMA because the exhibition just ended this February at SF MoMA. So these are their marketing folks' advice. How do you actually respond to a growing number of Chinese-speaking visitors? Use Chinese social media channels because, in my experience, very, very important for us to get information out in Chinese through platforms such as WeChat and Weibo, all kinds of things. And update your Mandarin web content regularly to encourage repeat visitors. Oh, this is fun. I was laughing when I read this. Stock a varied inventory, higher priced merchandise in the gift shop. Chinese tourists traditionally bring back lush gifts and souvenirs. I mean, this is totally new for our shop managers. When I share this, just like, oh my God, you know. And also, I think that actually some of the tour agencies brought a lot of group visitors from China. because New York, San Francisco, Boston, these are tourist destinations for Chinese folks. So we need to work directly with China tour operators, but also very importantly, just do not limit your outreach to one Chinese exhibition, because this is really changing is because Chinese collectors, Chinese visitors, they are very cosmopolitan these days. They are not just focusing on China exhibition, they're interested because of the cultural background. They're also interested in non-Chinese art exhibitions, both contemporary and historical. Well, I think they also learned some lessons is buy exhibition tickets and purchases in gift shop easy by accepting online mobile payments. So everything now is through WeChat and WeChat Pay, all kinds of things. So with that, I'll end my presentation and look forward to our discussion. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Dr. Vivian Lee. Vivian Lee is Associate Curator of Asian Art at the Worcester Art Museum, where she oversees the Asian Art Collection and Exhibition Program since 2015. Dr. Lee held curatorial fellowship at the Dallas Museum of Art and the Guggenheim Museum, and was a curatorial assistant of Asian Art at the Museum of Fine Arts, Houston, where she contributed to several exhibitions, including Red Hot, Asian Art Today from the Cheney Family Collection, Your Bright Future, 12 Contemporary Artists from Korea, and the commissioning of Saigo Chan's 42 panel painting, Odyssey. At Worcester, she has organized Yonghae Chan Heavy Industries, The Beauties of Tyranny, and Reusable Universes. Jung Hwan, as well as established the museum's International Artists in Residence program, supporting emerging to mid-career artists from Southeast Asia. Dr. Lee has contributed articles to various edited volumes and journals, such as the Oxford Art Journal, Art History, and Issue, Journal of Contemporary Chinese Art, and is an exhibition reviewer for the Brooklyn Rail. She received her PhD in Chinese art history from the University of Michigan. Today's talk is titled Chinese Contemporary Art and the Question of Relevance. Please welcome Vivian.
Thank you so much, Natsu. And it's great to be back. As Natsu said, I graduated from here in 2015, so it's great to be back after 4 years, back here in Ann Arbor. And thank you also to Fan, and also to her sister, Carol, who for organizing this symposium. And definitely, I feel very honored to be part of this symposium as well. As Melissa Chiu just mentioned during her talk, a lot of this history of the contemporary Chinese or Chinese contemporary art wasn't even written, and so many of the speakers here today, I have benefited a lot from your writings. So as you can see on the screen, the title has changed as I thought some more about my contribution or what I could maybe bring up differently or than what my other illustrious the co-panelists can talk about. And I think it actually works very well that I come right after Daisy's talk, because what I'll speak about will be a lot about the issues of working as a curator in an encyclopedic art museum rather than a specialized art museum such as Contemporary Art Museum or an Asian art specific museum, and also how working as the Asian art curator, how to negotiate or try to find a fit between the relationship between Chinese traditional art and contemporary Chinese contemporary art. So while the 1990s debates on multiculturalism gave leverage and strategy to introduce key early exhibitions of contemporary art from China, the 2000s have witnessed dramatic changes in the contemporary art scene for art from China. We are now in an exciting transitional moment where we are witnessing the shift from the presentation of new art from China to historicizing contemporary art from China. As the other speakers have already mentioned, in the last 20 years, we have seen mid-career retrospectives of Chinese contemporary artists such as Huang Yongping at the Walker Art Museum, as well as Tai Guochan at the Guggenheim. Two such group survey shows with historical breadth, such as Ink Art, curated by Max Hearn at the Met 5 years ago, Art in China after 1989, organized by the Guggenheim last year. And also coming up this summer, The Lure of Matter, material art from China that's organized by LACMA and curated by Wu Hong. And we'll be traveling, as I believe, to Seattle, as well as Peabody, Essex, and also Smart Museum in Chicago. The early 2000s also witnessed increasingly nomadic Chinese artists taking up important art and cultural positions in China in its actively developing domestic contemporary art scene, while also keeping studios and residencies abroad. Wang Qingsong's current work on view here at UMMA in many ways embodies this wide-ranging interest in finding dialogue between similar socioeconomic systems and structures in widely different places that these artists live or have lived in, as well as, more importantly, the human impacts and results of these systems on the people, such as in Wang Qingsong's work, focusing on collective action in Beijing as well as Detroit. With the increasing institutional recognition of Chinese contemporary art, as well as other contemporary art outside of Europe and America, there seems to be an increasing rather than diminishing importance on articulating place-bound identities at the museum in a growing, seemingly borderless world. For example, in the last decade, museum labels for contemporary artworks have noticeably also started to include information about the place-bound identity of artists, such as you can see here. I hope we can read, but let me know if there's any trouble reading these. But I find it very interesting. Now they list not only perhaps the nationality of the artist, but also where they were born, such as in the Jenny Holzer piece over there about where she was born in Ohio, and other labels, such as the one on the far right from the Guggenheim. They, as curators, we're all naturally very curious about labels, just to preface that. So these are like labels or pictures of labels I've taken over the years. So I just start noticing these new norms or standards being adopted across the board at different museums. And so the one at the Guggenheim, where it also lists not only where they were born, but also where they live and work today. So I find it very interesting, this kind of increased awareness of in contemporary art of identity or place-bound identities, or of foregrounding that in the label too. With the increased attention to the diversity of contemporary art and artists existing outside the assumed traditional centers of Paris and New York, the distinction of place becomes significant. The integration of contemporary art from China and other non-Europe and American countries into the museum environment in a way, contemporary art is forcing a reevaluation of the use of place and place-bound identities as key concepts to organize the exhibition and understanding of Chinese contemporary art in U.S. art museums. In my talk today, instead of focusing on the exhibition of Chinese contemporary art, which I know many of you will be talking about, I will turn to instead something that is less glamorous, but is just as crucial to the role of the museum and is responsibility of the curators of the museums. The inclusion and incorporation of Chinese contemporary art into the permanent art galleries and the collection of the museum, rather than in special temporary exhibitions that are just up for maybe 3 to 6 months, and then you have a book and that is it. But this question comes a lot from my own, since arriving at the Worcester Art Museum, I've been tasked to plan the reinstallation of the Asian art galleries. And so I've been noticing, so a lot of these thoughts are kind of loose, but thoughts that have accumulated from my just thinking very much about the permanent art galleries, what stays up permanently and represents the collection, and it is, in a way, represents the art history and the narrative art history that the museums represent, rather than the more temporary exhibitions. I would argue that the museum's permanent art galleries and collections are essential for us to think more than temporary exhibitions, especially today, about the established recognition of Chinese contemporary art. So I will look at the concept of place in three interrelated ways to explore what is the place of Chinese contemporary art at the art museum. First, place as a cultural identifier. Second, place as a physical place in the museum. And finally, place as the local community in which the museum is situated and serves. From the perspective as working as an Asian art curator in an encyclopedic museum where art that falls under my purview goes from ancient to contemporary, from art from Mumbai to Hanoi, I feel that the persistence of place and place-bound identities in museums urgently need to be considered in how it shapes how we display, collect, and exhibit Chinese contemporary art, or for that matter, contemporary art from Asia or non-Western countries in general. Ultimately, a renewed concept of place as an encyclopedic museum touches on the ultimate question of the relevance of the public art museum and the 21st century art and society. So many of the questions of relevance in museums today revolve around the notions of it's still working. Notions of inclusion, diversity, and access. Over the last 10 to 15 years, these three terms have repeatedly appeared on many conference themes, workshop topics, and lecture titles at anybody who works in the museum profession know from attending professional flagship organizations such as the Association of Art Museum Directors. I wonder if there's any cars going around. But the Association of Art Museum Curators, Association of Art Museum Directors, and the American Alliance of Museums. All of them are actively thinking about these three terms of inclusion, diversity, and access. Museums endeavor to remain relevant. Of course, we don't want to become irrelevant. So it comes in large part from this desire to connect with society's changing population demographics and visitor audience who are becoming more diverse. This relevance has included greater attention paid to reflecting the diversity of the community. Museums are collecting more women and African American artists, for instance, and auction houses and dealers are, of course, meeting this demand in their marketing and sales. I guess I didn't notice the screen's not working. Oh, is it back? Or? Oh, is it back? Thank you. So as I mentioned, there's certain artists, such as African American artists, as well as women artists, that are becoming more prominent, and also museums are very eager to buy art by African and American and women artists. Museums are also addressing the lack of diversity in their collection by highlighting such works' absence in their collections, like the subtle labeling of slave owners that happened in our museum last year in our American Portrait Gallery that raised the awareness of the social and economic realities that portraiture painting relied on. My American art colleague also brought to light with this project the context of luxury and wealth needed for commissioning a painted portrait in colonial America, and also why there are very few portraits of African American sitters. Yet unlike African American art or women art that are missing or rare, Chinese art and Chinese contemporary art by association is in this strange position in the museum ecology, since Chinese art is far from absent in the permanent display and collections of American museums. And this is one of the very first galleries I've met of Chinese jades. The majority of encyclopedic art museums in the US, such as the Met, started collecting Asian art since the early 20th century, shortly after they were established. They would commonly have a gallery of Asian art besides galleries of American art and European art. Some museums may also have galleries devoted to Islamic art or African art, but at least they would have often one for Asian art. Though there has always been a dedicated physical gallery for Asian art in the museum, how does Chinese contemporary art fit into this model of the encyclopedic museum? Does Chinese contemporary art go into the Chinese art gallery or the gallery of contemporary art? And this I'm talking about the permanent art galleries. Looking at the permanent galleries in museums today, the response is neither. There's no obvious place in the current makeup of museum permanent gallery spaces to show Chinese contemporary art. So as I mentioned, thinking about my work at the Worcester Art Museum, being tasked to reinstall the museum's suite of 4 Asian art galleries, this led me to think about how the galleries of Asian art fit within the context of the whole museum. And so these are pictures of our galleries, which follow the standard geographical and cultural arrangement of all encyclopedic museums in the US, where there are galleries devoted to classical Greek and Roman art, European art, or suite of European art, American art, and Asian art. Visitors typically encounter the arts of China, thus in the gallery of Chinese art. These are our 2 Chinese art galleries. Generally speaking, such galleries of Chinese art in an encyclopedic museum are arranged to reflect, in one room or a series of rooms, a survey of the major artistic traditions of China, from ancient Neolithic pottery and jades to the 19th century Qing ceramics. 20th century modern Chinese art is totally absent from permanent art gallery displays, thereby presenting the misconception that art in China experienced a near century of pause in artistic production from 1900 to the late 1970s when contemporary art begins. So also thinking about what happens with the whole 20th century, not just contemporary Chinese art, just to kind of throw out that kind of question to make it wider, to broaden the discussion. Likewise, in the permanent galleries dedicated to post-war and contemporary art from China rarely appears. Another aspect I noticed when examining the gallery setup in the museum was the different treatment of time. The former European art curator at my museum had once asked me, just why is the Asian art galleries divided by culture, China, Japan, Korea, and India? And I realized that for him, it does look a bit odd because European art history is divided according to chronology, or classical, medieval, Gothic, Renaissance, Baroque, neoclassical to modern. Asian art and cultures, on the other hand, are periodized according to dynasties and reigns in each country. The combination of Asian modern and contemporary art with mainstream narratives of modern and contemporary art may thereby seem forced and strange, since suddenly in the early 20th century, the chronologies of art histories becomes conflated into one sense of time and place. Chinese modern contemporary art inherits such structural problems of chronology and permanent gallery presentation of Chinese art at the museums. Yet, hopefully this will change as the historical understanding and scholarship on modern contemporary art in China grows. Chinese contemporary art can also broaden the Western-defined chronologies in terms of understanding modern and contemporary art history globally. Hopefully in the next few years, there will be changes in the institutional and foundational level at museums, and and with the increased historical understanding of Chinese contemporary art can somehow be incorporated into the permanent display galleries of Chinese art or contemporary art, or maybe something totally different, rather than just as a special temporary exhibition. When I was at the MFA, before I came here to Michigan, we attempted early on to integrate Chinese contemporary art into the Arts of China gallery when we were reinstalling that gallery. We try to think of how to bring Chinese contemporary art. Oh, it's going again. Where I hold it back? It's I'll just feedback. If I can't change that computer, maybe I should change. That's okay. Is there something I'm pressing? Just in case. Okay. No, it's just going by itself. Yeah.
To be a little less pretty, but we'll. All right, so just use up and down. That way you can keep going.
Okay. Thanks. So we try to incorporate by the Chinese contemporary art into the reinstallation or the renovated new Chinese art gallery by commissioning Cai Guochan to make a gunpowder painting, his largest gunpowder painting to date. As you can see here, where he's making it with the help of over 100 volunteers. The gunpowder painting, landscape painting, was called Odyssey, and here's Cai in the installed 62-panel painting, or gunpowder painting of this work, which he based on Wang's famous painting, Living in the Fuchuan Mountains. This was made to cover the entire gallery, all the walls, in a way essentially acting as wallpaper. And in the end, though it dominated the gallery space and limited also the number of individual works that could be shown in that gallery. Though the original intention was to create a dialogue between bringing the past and the present together, where Cai's work would act as a portal between the two, it also reveals the pitfalls of conceiving a place for Chinese contemporary art in service to traditional pre-modern Chinese art in a permanent Arts in China display. Each museum's identities, specialty museums like contemporary art museums and Asian art museums, or encyclopedic art museums like my own, is undeniably also defined by its permanent collection, which is usually what is on display in the permanent galleries. At the museum, when I talk about acquiring works from contemporary Asia, I not only related to the museum's Asian art collection, but to the entire collection. For example, in proposing the Korean contemporary artist Yang Hae-chan Heavy Industries' The Beauty of Tyranny for acquisition, like any other potential acquisitions, I contextualized its importance and how it will contribute to the museum's contemporary art collection, not its Korean traditional art collection. So I would talk with my colleagues about how it would deal with the, U.S., where the video deals with the history of U.S. immigration, would also expand the time-based media holdings, most notably Namjoon Paik's Robert Goddard, Bill Viola's Union, and also more recently acquired Christian Marclay's Telephones. I also described to our acquisitions committee how the work would allow future programs and exhibitions around art and technology, art and politics, word and image, as well as citizenship and immigration. So it also did not make sense to talk about or contextualize Yan Hei-chan's heavy industries works in the context of how it would contribute to the Korean art collection. So it's a lot about talking about not just Chinese contemporary art, but also Asian contemporary art, is about negotiating or thinking about how to not just place it within the traditional Asian art collections, but making sure conveying to also my colleagues and also the acquisitions committee and people from the community that listen to our acquisitions reports to talk about how the contemporary art is also meaningful to the dialogue of, or the discourse of contemporary art history. This is also true when 2 years ago, acquiring Yiyou Fun's Untitled from his recent body of work, where he did a residency at the renowned French Imperial Kiln in Sèvres. Instead of just comparing him to Korean ceramics, I also compared it to our substantial holdings of historic Sèvres French porcelain from the 19th century. Many of you might not know of Sèvres, but it was a porcelain kiln established by King Louis XV in the southwest suburbs of Paris. So Sèvres is one of the most preeminent porcelain kilns in Europe. We also discussed how Li's Untitled could give global and contemporary resonance to the museum's historic Sèvres French porcelain. Though Yan Hei-chan and Yiyou Fun's works are two contemporary artists from Korea, like Chinese contemporary art, they reflect that our acquisition of contemporary art from Asia for our museum is obviously not done in isolation of other historical and contemporary works in the American and European art collections or other parts of the museum's collection. But in the process of acquiring these two works, I also have come to wonder how the inclusion of contemporary art from China and other Asian countries like Korea can actually change the existing museum systems for display and interpretation of art. Recently, my museum's registrar suggested eliminating totally the whole category of contemporary art in our database, and starting with works made in the 1960s and 1970s, redistributing the works into the existing classification categories by nation. American art, European art, Asian art, and so on, or into photography, prints, drawings, since we have that department. While to the registrar, his suggestion sounds like a practical matter of just simply database cleanup or streamlining, to me it implies that contemporary artworks from Asia acquired by the museum today will eventually might be reassigned and redistributed to the Asian art galleries in the future. I mean, his comments or his proposal did make me think what will happen in 30 years or 50 years or 100 years, because these works will stay in the museum permanently in permanent collection, and what will our generations way beyond our lifetimes, how will they be talking or processing and thinking about these works when they are no longer contemporary? The registrar's suggestion to incorporate the contemporary art into the existing systems of how we tell art history at the museum by place and cultures made me wonder if these, contemporary Asian art, as well as contemporary African art, South American art, contemporary art from the Middle East, how can these now intervene in the 19th century model of the art history and art museums that these museums were built conceptually as well as physically to present and embody for the community? The need to create more global and diverse views of art history offered at museums seem even more urgent today as museums endeavor increasingly to reflect the realities of their rapidly changing and diversifying communities. Going back to Yan Hui-chan, Heavy Industries, The Beauty of Tyranny, the acquisition of this work was also just made sense for our museum because of the relationship it has to the city, how the U.S. national debates on immigration and citizenship directly affects the city and county of Worcester, which since the city's founding has been a place for many immigrants to build a new life in America. It has been shaped by different waves of immigrants from East Europeans in the early 20th century to Africans and Southeast Asians today. It is one of the major resettlement cities for refugees in the U.S. In 2017, when we purchased The Beauty of Tyranny into the museum's collection, in our central Renaissance courtyard, we hosted for the first time the naturalization ceremony of 50 people to become new American citizens. As the people in the world, including artists in China, and continue to become more interconnected, there's much more work to still be done in the foundational structure of the museum institution to change the narratives that we inherited and allow us to make new ones so that the museum can truly be a place for all. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Vivian, to be very graceful in spite of the technical difficulties. And our last speaker in the morning session is Christopher Phillips. He's an independent curator and critic and former curator at the International Center of Photography in New York between 2000 and 2016. Mr. Phillips curated exhibitions which explore modernist photography of the early 20th century as well as contemporary Asian photography and media art, including Between Past and Future, New Photography and Video from China, co-curated with Hirschhorn in 2004. Wang Qingsong, When Worlds Collide, which was in 2011, and Han Yun-Su, Photographs of Seoul, 1956 to 63, in 2016. And Life and Dreams, Contemporary Chinese Photography and Media Art, which happened last year. He's author and co-author of many monographs, including The New Vision, Photographs from the Ford Motor Company collection in 1989, Photography in the Modern Era, European Documents and Critical Writings, 1913 to 1940 in 1989, Between Past and Future, New Photography and Video from China in 2004, and Life and Dreams, Contemporary Chinese Photography and Media Art, published in 2018. He serves on the board of Asian Art Archive America, editorial board of the Trans-Asia Photography Review, and International Advisory Committee for Three Shadows Photography Center. His talk today is titled Curating Chinese Contemporary Photography and Media Art and at U.S. Institutions. Please welcome Mr. Phillips.
All right, it's not moving. Okay, thank you. Okay, it's a pleasure to be here this morning and to see so many old friends and meet new friends here in Ann Arbor. I'm going to talk this morning about two specific exhibitions that I was directly involved in. In just a moment, I'll say a little bit more about the image on the screen, which shows a group of bright-eyed young people at Hohai Lake in Beijing in I'll say that I will struggle to stay on topic. Melissa's talk this morning brought back so many memories of people and places where we almost intersected over the years. And I will try not to get distracted and tell the stories that I recall about some of those individuals. I'll start by saying that I made my first trip to Beijing in the fall of 1999. At that point, I was working as an editor at Art in America with Richard Vine. I was very much aware of all the exhibitions and catalogs that Melissa brought to our attention earlier this morning, but I really had no specific knowledge about what was happening in China on the ground among artists and critics and museum people there. Completely by chance, in the late 1990s, I was teaching a survey class of contemporary art at the School of Visual Arts in New York. In those years, there was suddenly an influx of students from mainland China who had found a way to get visas and fellowships. One of those students that I met there was a young woman photographer, Xing Danwen, who talked to me a lot about what was going on in China, and she and her Chinese classmates said, "You've really got to come to China. It's really crazy right now. You won't believe what's going on with the artists." It was with her help that I went to Beijing in fall of 1999 to give a series of lectures at Tsinghua University. And really thanks to her efforts, on that first trip to Beijing, I met many of the artists and people on the art scene in Beijing, often without really knowing who they were, but I was assured that these were the leading figures that I really ought to meet. So on that first trip, remarkably, I was able to meet people like Li Shanting, Ai Weiwei. I remember also Hans van Dyck, a very eccentric Dutch art scholar who was engaged in starting a gallery with Ai Weiwei. And all of those people had lots of time to sit and drink tea and tell their stories about the roles that they had played in the development of Chinese contemporary art in the previous decade. The next year, in 2000, I moved to a new job as curator at the International Center of Photography in New York. And the first big project that I proposed was to do a comprehensive exhibition looking at current photography and media art, which was at that time called video art, and got permission to go ahead with preparations for that show with a projected opening date of 2004. A few months after that, I made another trip to Beijing and went to visit Ai Weiwei and told him about what I was doing and gave him my ideas about what an exhibition project should be. And he was silent for a minute or two and said, "You know, there's someone you should really talk to. He was here last week, and he has an exhibition idea that sounds exactly the same as yours. It's Professor Wu Hung from Chicago." And my heart sank because I knew that Wu Hung is one of the most productive people on the planet, publishing at least one or two new books every year and organizing exhibitions at a prodigious clip. So I thought, I've probably missed my chance. He's probably already prepared to open his show in the coming months. At any rate, when I was back in the US, I met with Wu Hung when he passed through New York, and we sat down and talked for a whole afternoon at ICP. And we discovered that, in fact, we had almost identical ideas for an exhibition looking at the previous 10 years of photography and video in China, with the same 4 thematic categories and the list of artists, and in some cases, in a lot of cases, exactly the same works. We talked a lot that afternoon and finally decided it would be foolish for us to organize 2 competing identical exhibitions. So in a burst of maturity, we said, let's collaborate, and we'll do this as a collaboration between the Art Museum at the University of Chicago and ICP. And we said, because we see now that it's really going to be a big show, we should probably find partner exhibitions in our cities. And so quickly the idea arose to approach Asia Society in New York and the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago. And with just a few phone calls and emails, that four-way partnership fell into place. And that brings us to the summer of 2002, when Wu Hong and I made the studio rounds in Beijing. The young woman in the photograph, Chaos Chen Yang, was sort of our liaison with the artists and the museum people that we talked to. And the fellow standing next to me was one of ICP's board members at that point, Arthur Walther, who had recently retired after a very successful career in the financial world in New York. He had lots of time on his hands and really wanted to learn about collecting. So we spent a week in Beijing, a week in Shanghai, and really began to put together the list of artists and the works for the exhibition. Okay. It opened in the summer of 2004 in New York at ICP and Asia Society. Melissa Chiu, as curator at Asia Society, was directly involved in the preparations for the show, along with Vishaka Desai, who was at that point the gallery director at Asia Society. Between Past and Future, New Photography and Video from China was the title. It was a big show. There were about 55 artists all together in the exhibition. The works ranged from the early 1990s up to the present, which was 2004 at that point. There were 4 categories: history and memory, reimagining the body, people and place, which was really about urbanization, and performing the self. Okay, this is for my fellow curators out there who are all, we all spend more time than we should working up budgets like this. This was a real challenge, coming up with a budget for 4 museums and to have conference calls and try to determine who would be responsible for what and how much money people thought they could raise. So this is just the project development and exhibition budget, catalog budget, exhibition tour budget, and then the installation budget. In total, I think the show cost a little over $1 million to do, which today sounds like almost nothing. It seemed like a lot of money at that time. But because at that moment there was so much interest in Chinese contemporary art, we had no problem at all raising the funds from various foundations and individuals. Wu Hong and his colleagues at the Smart Museum at the University of Chicago took the main responsibility for putting the catalog together, and I worked on the exhibition planning, which turned out to be quite challenging. First, a lot of the Chinese artists were making works in enormous sizes. Wang Qingsong, for example, we decided to show the largest possible version of his classic work, Night Revels of Lao Li, featuring Li Shanting playing the role of a kind of disgraced imperial court figure from the past. The work is 30 feet long. How do you make plans to tour a work that won't fit, that can't go through most museum doorways and elevators? We had to devise a way to deframe the work and roll it up and break down the frame so that it could be disassembled and shipped and reassembled at each of the 6 traveling venues, and we were able to do that. Simply getting the thing onto the wall was a challenge, as you can see here. It took a lot of people and a lot of care in order to place this work properly. A number of the artists came to New York to make sure that their works were properly installed. This is Lin Tian Miao, who came to install her work braiding, which again was this was quite tricky to get this from Beijing to New York. It's a work that features an enormous image of her face on the other side of that hanging fabric, and in the back of the fabric you see a kind of cascade of white cotton strings that get thicker and thicker and become braids on the white platform behind. But in the end, that went up without too much difficulty over the course of a day, and then traveled for the length of the show. Looking back, it seems to me that many of the works in that exhibition have become classics of Chinese contemporary art. We've already seen Jung Hwan's Family Tree several times. This morning on the left we see Song Dong stamping the water, which again, it's included in almost every retrospective look at Chinese contemporary art from the 1990s and early 2000s. Remarkably enough, Wu Heng and I, even though we were coming from very different perspectives, saw eye to eye on the artist and the works that seem most significant to us and should be included. His background was really almost entirely within the realm of traditional and contemporary Chinese art. My background was really international contemporary art, and I think it gave us both a certain amount of confidence to see that we both, after a certain amount of research and study and thinking and comparison, came to really the same conclusions about what seemed interesting and timely and significant. Okay, so I'll show you just a few images of the installation that we were just at ICP. This was the Asia Society part of the New York presentation, and it's Wang Qingsong's Past, Present, Future in the center. We see Gu Deshin to the left, and you can get a little glimpse of Hong Lei on the right. Gu Deshin again, Xu Jin, and Rong's photographs of Jung Hwan performances from the Beijing East Village period in 1993-94. This is a wonderful Xu Jin work. These are all images that he printed onto Post-its and randomly arranged on a white wall. The images, he said, you've got to explain in the wall label, all these images he made from pornographic websites, but he edited them carefully enough so that you don't really see much at all. As a consequence, throughout the run of the show, you could see groups of people clustered, eagerly trying to get a glimpse of something spicy, and those efforts were always frustrated, which was the artist's intention. Now, the exhibition traveled, as I said, to 6 different locations, and I was responsible for managing the tour, which turned out to be an almost full-time job for 3 years. But it was very interesting for me to see how the exhibition manifested different aspects of the artist's work in different locations. At the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago, for example, the lighting, as you can see, it was very cool, very even, and it really made the work seem much more conceptual and intellectualized than at any other of the venues. And there you see Lin Tian Miao's work again in a slightly different presentational form. there you see again Jung Hwan Song-dong and Wang Qingsong, and you can just glimpse Wu Heng taking someone around the corner. And here's Wu Heng doing one of his dynamic museum tours for a group of people at the time of the opening there. Probably the most polished presentation of that exhibition was at the Victoria and Albert in London, where, because of their own space constraints, they really edited the size of the show fairly dramatically and made it look much more decorative than it had appeared anywhere else. I mean, that's, decoration is what they do, and they're very good at it. And in the foreground, you see In Shu Jin's installation work, group of cotton shoes, and in the soles of those shoes, if you look carefully, you see photographs of the artist at different stages of her life. Okay, still the V&A video work by Wang Gongxin. You see Wang Qingsong in the background. You can glimpse Miao Xiaochun work. But I think you can see how at the V&A the lighting is very sophisticated, and it creates its own kind of narrative, leading visitors through the galleries. Okay, here's Hong Hao photographic scroll work, Zhang Dali's demolition in Beijing photographs, and I believe that's Yang Yang on the far wall. Now, throughout the whole tour, what was, I guess, most interesting and most rewarding for me was the prospect of inviting 3 or 4 artists to come to the opening of each of the exhibitions and to do full-day public programs with Wu Heng and myself. I know that all those presentations were video recorded. I have no idea how you would access those now, but I remember them being really interesting, filled with great questions and responses from various members of the audience. This was at the Nasher Museum at Duke University, and that's Hong Lei on the left, Zhang Dali in the middle, and on the right, Sui Shuwen, who very sadly died last year. Now, I left ICP 3 years ago in 2016, and almost immediately got a phone call from Arthur Walther, whom we saw in that first image, who had continued collecting Chinese contemporary photography, sometimes with suggestions from myself, sometimes with advice from Wu Heng. And his collection had grown to a significant size, and so he called me and said, why don't we do a show at my new private museum in Germany and show that Chinese collection and make a big catalog. And so we did it, and the exhibition opened in May last year with a 400-page catalog, which is available now. The exhibition was called Life and Dreams, Contemporary Chinese Photography and Media Art. Life and Dreams, I think I stole from the title of photo work by Zheng Guogu, because I thought it was so apt for what we were doing. Arthur Walther, in his hometown in Ulm, Germany, built a very nice private museum. This is he tore down his family house and built a museum there and museum storage. It's very much along the lines of the Mies van der Rohe National Gallery in Berlin, if you know that building. A small space above ground, and then down below ground in a kind of art bunker, about 15,000 square feet of exhibition space. And that exhibition team, myself and Arthur and Daniela Baumann, who was the manager of the space in Ulm. Over the years, Arthur Walther became himself not only a really good curator, but he learned what curators do. He traveled quite a lot in Africa with Okwi and Wazor, whom Melissa mentioned earlier today, put together a big, fabulous collection of contemporary African photography, and really became expert at doing studio visits, imagining how to put an overall collection together, how to put an exhibition on the walls, to make catalogs. Really became a kind of self-taught but consummate museum professional. It was interesting for me to recontact a number of the artists who had been in the 2004 exhibition and to work with them to come up with some fresh ways of presenting those older works. For example, I got in contact with Zhuang Hui in Beijing, someone who had worked closely with Ai Weiwei in the 1990s. And we came up with a way to turn what originally was a very small photo piece called 1 in 30, in which he did joint self-portraits with 30 contemporary Beijing artists. This is circa 1995. Jung Hwan, Ai Weiwei, Song Dong, the whole list is in there. And we asked him, how would you like to present that? And he had the idea of making that a floor-to-ceiling wall presentation, and in fact it turned out spectacularly well, and Daniela was able to get that up in less than a day. We brought in a lot of media work. As I was working on the exhibition, it really became clear to me that the period from the early 1990s to the early 2000s was the most intense and productive moment for Chinese photography, and that the media art that began in that period had never really been examined as carefully as it should be, so we started to track down the video accompaniments to the work of many of the artists. Here you can see it's about 10 Chinese artists. Jung Hwan is in there, and Ma Liuming. How to raise an anonymous mountain by 1 meter, nude performance piece on the outskirts of Beijing. Well known as a single photographic image, but as it turns out, there is a spectacularly interesting video as well, which we included in the show. Here you can see that lower level at the Walther collection in Ulm, and you see a lot of the classic works on the wall: Song Dong stamping the water, Ai Weiwei dropping the Han Dynasty vase, works by Lin Tianmiao and Wang Qingsong in that space as well. In that same cluster of buildings in Ulm, there are 2 smaller buildings which are still very much domestic, and so we installed a number of works in those shows, in those buildings, in a kind of like home gallery style. Early video works by Zhang Pei Li, and we'll see this more recent work by Mo Yi again in just a second. Yang Fudong's 6-channel video east of Chui Village, one of his best video installations, I thought, was one of the highlights of the Ulm exhibition. I was able to persuade Arthur to come up to the present with the media works in China, because I think that's really where the real action is in Chinese contemporary art right now. So he was able to acquire some great video pieces by Lu Yang, for example, the young Shanghai woman new media artist who is doing extraordinary things. And Cheng Ran, great media artist who appeared in Yang Fudong's 7 Intellectuals as one of the 7 intellectuals, and then spun off his own career as a very, very good media artist. We showed some of his works. And then showing in Germany made it possible to consider bringing some works out of China that I knew would never be exhibited in China itself. For the collection, Arthur Walther acquired a fascinating large-scale work by Yi, who is an extremely eccentric and uneven, but sometimes just remarkably prescient photographer and photo artist. And I knew that in 2016, Yi had made a piece looking back to the Cultural Revolution, which is the work that you see on the wall. His idea was that he felt strongly that the Chinese Communist Party needed to be encouraged to make a formal apology to the Chinese people for launching the Cultural Revolution in May of 1966. And so he searched for images on the internet showing Mao and the party leaders and some of the darker moments of the Cultural Revolution. On each of those photographic enlargements, he has written the name of the year in Chinese characters from 1966 up to the present. And in addition, on each of those images, he has hand inscribed in ink the May 16th date, which is the date of the Communist Party communique, which officially launched the Cultural Revolution in 1966. So it's a remarkable work that I knew it'll probably be 100 years before this is ever exhibited in China. But it was possible to obtain one of these works and get it out of the country and put it on display in Ulm. The reaction to the exhibition in Germany, I thought, was really quite interesting and very, very distinct from the way that in 2004 the presentation in New York attracted enormous media attention and attention from critics, sometimes sympathetic, sometimes not. But the 2004 exhibition came at a moment when there was enormous curiosity about what was happening in contemporary Chinese art, photography, video, and a lot of anticipation, a lot of very positive hopes. In 2018, I think the situation is very different, and the show in Ulm attracted in Germany much more skeptical press reaction, and it was lots of commentary on Ai Weiwei's presence in Germany, living essentially in exile now and being based in Beijing. And also a lot of commentary about the absence from much recent Chinese photography and media art of any kind of critical, cultural, or political commentary. The Ulm exhibition will travel starting next year to a number of venues in South America. I thought it was not interesting to try to travel the exhibition in the US, but I thought taking it to South America, where, as you are all aware, China is an increasing economic and political presence, I thought that could start some interesting conversation. So the show will go to Mexico City and to Sao Paulo and probably a couple other venues in South America over the next 2 years, and we will see what happens there. So that brings my presentation of this case study to a conclusion, and I think now is the point that all of this morning's speakers will gather to answer your questions and listen to your comments. So thank you for your attention.
Well, thank you. Christopher. And although you said that this is a time for the questions and answers, this is already past 11:30, and we scheduled our lunch between 11:30 and 12:30. So, and we like to invite all of you here to lunch, and I think we can continue the conversation. And if you have any questions to any of the speakers, you can ask them. And we will, have a really exciting program in the afternoon. So thank you.